My name is Mason Harper. I am 34 years old, and I work as a facilities technician in Mesa, Arizona, which basically means I spend my nights crawling through hot utility corridors, fixing electrical panels, resetting breakers, and making sure other people's businesses keep running while mine quietly falls apart at home. And 6 months ago, I still believed I was just an exhausted husband trying to hold my marriage together, not realizing that my wife Vanessa had already turned me into a punchline inside her polished Tempe brunch circle. A group of women who wore oversized sunglasses indoors, spoke in curated half-whispers about investment properties and Pilates memberships, and treated Sunday brunch like it was a live-streamed event, even when there were no cameras officially rolling. That particular Sunday, I had just wrapped up a brutal overnight shift at a distribution center where 2 separate panels had shorted out, leaving me running back and forth across concrete floors under fluorescent lights that buzzed loud enough to feel like they were drilling into my skull. And by the time I clocked out, the sun was already climbing over the desert horizon, staining the sky in that pale orange that usually feels peaceful, but that morning only reminded me that I had not slept in over 20 hours. I drove home in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, my eyes burning and my body heavy in that hollow way that comes from being past exhaustion, and all I wanted was to collapse in a bed, pull the blackout curtains closed, and shut the world out for a few hours. Instead, my phone lit up with Vanessa's name again and again. 3 texts in a row, then 2 more, each one sharper than the last, telling me not to embarrass her by skipping, reminding me that everyone's husbands were coming, insisting that it was important for me to show face, and even though she never said it directly, the implication was clear that if I did not show up, I would once again prove that I did not care enough about her social life to support it. I stood in the shower longer than I needed to, letting the hot water hit the back of my neck, trying to wash off the smell of dust and metal, staring at the tile, and telling myself that this was what being a good husband meant, that marriage required effort even when you were tired, even when you felt out of place, even when the people you were trying to impress had never once shown genuine interest in your existence beyond asking what exactly a facilities technician did in a tone that made it sound like I fixed toilets for a living. I changed into the cleanest button-down shirt I owned, one Vanessa had picked out because she said neutral tones photograph better, and I drove across town toward Tempe, passing palm trees and strip malls and luxury apartment complexes that looked nothing like the modest house we shared in Mesa, and the entire drive I rehearsed small talk in my head, preparing myself to nod politely while listening to conversations about destination weddings, crypto portfolios, and boutique fitness studios. I never felt like I belonged around her friends, women who seemed to exist inside some curated online highlight reel, where husbands were accessories, homes were staged like magazine spreads, and brunch plates were photographed from 3 different angles before anyone was allowed to take a bite. When I pulled into the parking lot of the upscale cafe they always chose, I sat in my truck for a moment longer than necessary, watching couples step out of SUVs and luxury sedans, laughing easily, dressed like they had somewhere important to be, and I reminded myself that showing up mattered, that consistency mattered, that love sometimes looked like driving across town on 2 hours of sleep just so your wife would not have to explain your absence. And at that point, I still believed that if I kept proving I cared, eventually she would see me the same way I saw her, not as a liability or an embarrassment, but as a partner who was trying, even when he was running on empty. The rooftop cafe in downtown Tempe was already packed when I stepped out of the elevator, the late morning sun bouncing off the surrounding glass buildings and reflecting harshly off metal patio furniture, the hum of conversation blending with clinking glasses and forced laughter that sounded just a little too loud to be natural. And as I scanned the crowd for Vanessa, I spotted her instantly, because she was seated at the center of a long table like she was hosting a small event rather than meeting friends for brunch. Oversized sunglasses perched on her head, hair perfectly styled, her posture straight and deliberate, as if she knew she might be photographed at any second. When she noticed me walking toward the table, she did not stand, did not wave, did not even offer a small smile of relief that her husband had shown up after working all night. She simply flicked her fingers toward an empty chair at the far end of the table, and said "There you are" in a tone that felt less like greeting and more like acknowledgement that an item she had been expecting had finally arrived, and I slid into the spare seat quietly, placing my phone face down on the table and nodding politely at the other husbands and boyfriends who were already mid-conversation about golf outings and startup investments. The waitress came by, and I ordered a plain black coffee because the idea of heavy food after a night of inhaling electrical dust made my stomach twist, and while I sat there trying to stay alert, Vanessa and her friends launched into a detailed breakdown of a planned luxury girls' weekend in Santa Barbara, talking about oceanfront villas, wine tastings, spa packages, and a private chef they were considering hiring for one of the nights, casually tossing around numbers that climbed into the Thousands like they were discussing the price of takeout. And I did the math automatically in my head, calculating how many overtime shifts it would take me to cover something like that, knowing that the total cost of their weekend would exceed my entire month of extra hours, the hours I had been working specifically to keep our finances steady. At one point, Vanessa laughed and leaned back in her chair, twirling her mimosa glass between her fingers, and said that she practically lived like a single woman anyway, because I was always working, and the table erupted in laughter, sharp and delighted, as if she had delivered the perfect punchline, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not because I did not understand the joke, but because I understood it too well, because I knew that the reason I was always working was the $3,600 in monthly household expenses that did not magically pay themselves. I stared into my coffee and reminded myself of the breakdown I had memorized by now, the fact that I covered roughly 68% of our total expenses, the bulk of the mortgage payment on the house in Mesa, both car payments including the SUV she insisted fit her brand better, the majority of utilities, insurance premiums, and the unpredictable extras that came with maintaining a lifestyle that looked effortless from the outside, but required constant financial maintenance behind the scenes. And I kept my expression neutral, while her friends nodded sympathetically at her comment, as if she were the one sacrificing something. No one at that table knew that the overtime shifts were not about ambition or avoidance, but about stability, about ensuring we never missed a payment, about making sure she could attend these brunches without worrying about whether the card would decline when the check arrived. And as they moved on to discussing boutique fitness memberships, and which Santa Barbara restaurant had the most aesthetic plating for photos, I sat there feeling less like a husband and more like background decor. Present but irrelevant, a silent contributor to a lifestyle that apparently came with the added bonus of being the joke at the end of the table. The moment everything changed did not come with a shout or a thrown drink or some dramatic explosion like you see in movies. It came disguised as another one of Vanessa's carefully delivered jokes, wrapped in a performative sigh and punctuated by the kind of smile she used when she knew she had an audience. And I remember the exact way she leaned back in her chair, tilting her head just enough to draw attention. Her manicured fingers wrapped around a half-empty champagne flute as she announced, loudly enough for not just our table, but half the patio to hear, that she gave our marriage maybe 5 more months at best. There was a split second of stillness before the reaction hit, and then her friends burst into laughter, loud and unrestrained, glasses clinking together in celebration, as if she had just delivered the cleverest line of the year rather than publicly forecasting the expiration date of our marriage. And I felt something shift inside me. Not anger at first, but clarity, a sudden cold awareness that this was not spontaneous, that the comfort in their laughter, the way they leaned toward her instead of looking surprised, meant this topic had already been dissected and analyzed in private conversations I had never been part of. I saw it in their faces, in the quick sideways glances that were not shocked but knowing, in the way one of them reached out to squeeze Vanessa's arm like she was validating something they had all agreed upon before this moment. And I understood in an instant that I had not just been the butt of a single joke, but a recurring character in their ongoing narrative, a case study they revisited over cocktails. And something about that realization felt heavier than any insult she could have thrown at me directly. My body was still exhausted from the overnight shift, my hands still carrying the faint smell of metal and insulation, no matter how long I'd scrubbed them in the shower. And yet my mind felt strangely calm, like a circuit had finally closed after months of static. And instead of raising my voice or demanding an explanation, I simply set my coffee cup down carefully, making sure it did not rattle against the saucer. And I looked at her without anger for the first time in a long time. I told her that 5 months was generous and that I gave it 5 minutes. And I heard my own voice register steady and even, almost detached, as if I were narrating a scene rather than living inside it. And before anyone could process what I meant, I reached for my left hand, felt the familiar weight of the gold band that had once symbolized partnership and permanence, and slid it off slowly, deliberately, letting the sunlight catch against the metal for a brief second before placing it flat on the table between 2 champagne flutes that still had condensation running down their sides. The ring made a soft, almost insignificant sound as it touched the glass surface, but the effect was immediate. The laughter died mid-breath, forks froze halfway to mouths, and the entire table went completely silent in a way that felt heavier than the noise that had filled the patio moments earlier. And for the first time since I had arrived that morning, I felt fully present, fully awake despite the lack of sleep, aware of every pair of eyes on me, not as an accessory, but as a decision being made in real time. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping lightly against the concrete floor, and I stood up without rushing, without theatrics, Just a man who had finally reached the end of something he had been trying to hold together alone. And as I looked down at the ring resting between those two flutes, I realized that the exhaustion I had been carrying for months was no longer about long shifts or overtime hours. It was about standing in a room where I was expected to fund a life I was simultaneously being mocked for inhabiting. And in that silence, I knew there was no going back to pretending I had not heard exactly what she had just said. Vanessa's chair scraped sharply against the patio as she stood up, the polished calm she had worn all morning cracking just enough for panic to show through, and she reached for my arm with fingers that had minutes earlier been wrapped casually around a champagne flute, insisting in a hushed but urgent voice that it was just girl talk, that I was overreacting, that I needed to sit back down before I embarrassed her, as if the real offense in that moment was not the public expiration date she had placed on our marriage, but my refusal to smile through it. I felt her grip tighten around my sleeve, and for a second I looked at her hand there, manicured nails pressing into fabric I had ironed despite barely sleeping, and I calmly removed her fingers from my arm without force, without anger, just with finality, and I told her there was nothing dramatic about refusing to stay married to someone who publicly announced my expiration date like it was a limited-time subscription. Her friends were frozen behind her, their earlier laughter replaced with stiff expressions and quick, nervous glances at each other, and I could sense the shift in atmosphere, the way the spectacle had stopped being amusing and started being real, and Vanessa kept talking over me, saying that everyone jokes like that marriages go through phases, that I was being sensitive, that I needed to relax. But I could hear the thin edge of desperation creeping into her voice because she understood. Before anyone else did that I was not performing, I was leaving. The Arizona sun hit me full in the face as I stepped away from the table and toward the stairs, the heat sharp and blinding after the shade of the patio umbrellas. And the city noise seemed louder all of a sudden, traffic rolling past, distant horns, music drifting up from somewhere on the street below. And behind me, I heard her call my name once, then again, sharper the second time, the syllables carrying across the rooftop in a way that felt almost surreal, like it was happening to someone else. But I did not turn around. Each step toward the parking lot felt deliberate, steady, and oddly calm, as if my body had already made peace with a decision my mind had been circling for months. And when I crossed the street, I could still hear her voice faintly over the hum of cars, but I kept my eyes forward, focused on my truck sitting exactly where I'd left it, sun reflecting off the windshield, the metal already warm from the midday heat. I opened the door and climbed inside, closing it firmly behind me, and the noise of the city muted instantly, replaced by the dull echo of my own breathing inside the cab. And that was when the adrenaline hit in full force, not as panic but as a tremor that started in my hands and worked its way up my arms, my fingers gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary as they began to shake uncontrollably. I stared straight ahead at the dashboard, at the faint layer of dust I never quite managed to wipe away, and I realized that I had just ended a 5-year marriage in less time than it had taken them to finish their drinks. The finality of it settled over me slowly, not dramatic or explosive, but heavy and undeniable, and I felt the weight of exhaustion crash back into my body now that the confrontation was over, layered with something else that felt almost like relief, because for the first time in a long time I had not swallowed an insult or laughed along to keep the peace. I had simply drawn a line and stepped across it, and as my hands continued to shake against the steering wheel under the relentless Arizona sun, I understood that whatever came next would be uncertain, but at least it would no longer involve pretending I had not heard exactly who she believed I was. That afternoon I drove straight to my longtime friend Kayla Morgan's apartment in Chandler, because it was the only place that felt neutral, somewhere not filled with shared furniture, shared photos, or shared expectations. And when he opened the door, he took one look at my face and stepped aside without asking for details, handing me a cold bottle of water before I even sat down, and I gave him the short version of what happened, trimming it down to the essentials because saying the full story out loud made it feel heavier than I was ready to carry. I told him she had joked about our marriage ending, that I had left my ring on the table, that I walked out, and Caleb just shook his head slowly, leaning back against his kitchen counter, absorbing it without trying to fix it, which I appreciated more than any advice he could have offered. His apartment was small but clean, the air conditioning humming steadily against the Arizona heat, and I sank into the corner of his couch, feeling the exhaustion from the overnight shift finally catching up to me, layered with the emotional crash of the confrontation, my body heavy and hollow at the same time, like I had been running on borrowed energy that had suddenly been reclaimed. For a few hours we barely spoke, the television playing some meaningless background noise while I stared at the ceiling and tried to process the fact that a 5-year marriage had unraveled in under 10 minutes on a rooftop patio. As evening settled in and the sky outside shifted from bright desert blue to a muted purple haze, My phone started vibrating against the coffee table with an intensity that felt almost aggressive, and when I finally picked it up, the screen was flooded with notifications. Over 40 missed calls and dozens of texts stacking on top of each other from Vanessa, and numbers I recognized as her friends. The messages escalating from confusion to outrage in real time. She accused me of humiliating her in front of everyone, of creating a scene, of acting unstable, and her friends chimed in with variations of the same theme, telling me I needed to come back and fix what I broke, insisting that I'd taken a harmless joke too far, framing the entire situation as if I had detonated something delicate rather than simply reacting to public disrespect. Reading through those messages did not make me angry the way I expected. It made me strangely clear-headed, because not one of them acknowledged what she had said or how it felt to hear your own spouse casually predict your expiration date for entertainment. And their focus on the embarrassment of the moment rather than the substance behind it confirmed something I had only half understood before. That image mattered more to them than integrity, that the optics of my departure were more offensive than the fact that my marriage had been treated like a countdown clock. I placed the phone face down again, letting it continue to vibrate uselessly against the table, and after a few more minutes of staring at the ceiling, I powered it off completely, cutting off the stream of notifications mid-surge, the sudden silence almost startling in its completeness. Caleb did not comment. He just tossed me a spare blanket and told me to take the couch as long as I needed, and when the apartment lights were turned off and the room fell into darkness, I lay there staring at the faint glow from the streetlights filtering through the blinds, replaying her voice in my head over and over again. The casual certainty with which she predicted our divorce like it was a trendy forecast everyone had already agreed upon. Sleep did not come easily despite the exhaustion, because every time I closed my eyes I could see the ring resting between those champagne flutes, hear the laughter that followed her announcement, and feel the exact moment something inside me finally stopped trying to negotiate for respect, and, as I lay on Caleb's couch listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner, I understood that whatever humiliation she believed I had caused her that day was nothing compared to the quiet erosion I had tolerated for years, and turning off my phone felt less like avoidance and more like the first boundary I had drawn in a long time. The next morning, I turned my phone back on expecting another flood of accusations, and instead the first message that caught my attention was from Rachel Simmons, the quiet one from the table who had barely spoken during the chaos on the rooftop, the one who had looked more uncomfortable than amused when Vanessa made her announcement, and her text was short and direct, asking if we could meet for coffee because she believed I deserved to know the truth. There was no dramatic tone, no emojis, no attempt to soften the request, just a straightforward sentence that felt heavier than the dozens of messages I had ignored the night before, and despite my instinct to avoid any connection to that brunch circle, I agreed. We met at a small cafe in Gilbert. Nothing flashy, just a place with mismatched wooden tables and the smell of fresh espresso hanging in the air, and Rachel arrived without the oversized sunglasses and curated confidence she had worn the day before, dressed simply, her posture slightly tense, as if she was carrying something she was not comfortable holding. She did not waste time with small talk, and after we ordered coffee she pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table toward me with a quiet apology in her eyes that felt more genuine than anything I had heard in months. The screen displayed screenshots from their private group chat, the one I had clearly never been meant to see, and as I scrolled through the messages my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with realization. Vanessa had been consulting a divorce attorney since March, months before that rooftop announcement, discussing strategy, asking about how to position herself financially, even joking about how she needed me to leave first so she could frame it as abandonment, because apparently optics mattered in court just as much as they did at brunch. There were messages where she talked about pushing my buttons, about making public comments that would either humiliate me into reacting or frustrate me enough to walk out, and the others responded with encouragement, advising her to document everything, to keep records of my work hours, to emphasize how absent I supposedly was, shaping a narrative where my overtime shifts were not sacrifices for stability, but evidence of emotional neglect. I read one message twice where she wrote that if I stormed off dramatically, it would make her case easier, and I felt a strange detachment settle over me, because I realized I had not disrupted her plan, I had simply accelerated it in a way she had not anticipated. Further down in the chat were conversations about money that made my stomach drop, admissions that she had quietly accumulated $18,000 in credit card debt over the past year, charges for boutique clothing, cosmetic treatments, and trips I had assumed were partially covered by her income, and then the message that explained everything else, the one where she confessed she had been laid off from her marketing job weeks earlier, and had not told me, choosing instead to maintain the illusion while discussing how to secure alimony once the divorce was filed. Rachel watched me read without interrupting, her expression tight with discomfort. And when I finally looked up, she told me she had not agreed with how far it had gone, that the rooftop joke had been part of a larger plan to provoke a reaction. And sitting there in that quiet Gilbert cafe, with the hum of espresso machines in the background, I felt something shift again inside me. Not heartbreak this time, but clarity. Because the humiliation on the patio had not been impulsive cruelty, it had been calculated strategy, and the marriage I thought I had been trying to save had already been dissected, priced, and prepared for liquidation long before I ever placed my ring between those champagne flutes. Within 48 hours of meeting Rachel in that small cafe in Gilbert, I sat inside a quiet office in Scottsdale across from a divorce attorney whose entire demeanor radiated controlled efficiency. And for the first time since that rooftop afternoon, I felt like I was no longer reacting, but acting, laying out the screenshots, the timeline, the financial details, and watching his expression tighten in the subtle way of someone who recognizes strategy when he sees it. He explained in calm, measured terms that filing first would neutralize any attempt to frame me as the one who abandoned the marriage, that documented evidence of premeditated planning would dismantle any narrative built around sudden emotional neglect, and hearing that transformed the chaos of the previous week into something structured and navigable. That same afternoon, I opened a separate bank account, sitting in a sterile branch office, signing forms with steady hands, redirecting my paycheck before the next deposit cycle hit, ensuring that the money I earned crawling through electrical rooms and working overtime shifts would no longer be feeding into a joint account that was quietly hemorrhaging under credit card balances I had never authorized. I moved carefully, methodically, not out of spite, but out of survival, reviewing automatic payments, separating utilities, documenting balances, and protecting what little financial stability I had built through years of early mornings and late nights. By the time Vanessa was formally served with divorce papers, the shock I felt on that patio had been replaced with something colder and more resolute. And when the call started again, they came not only from her, but through friends who suddenly adopted concerned tones, claiming there had been a misunderstanding, insisting she never meant what she said, urging me to reconsider before things went too far. I did not respond to most of them. And when she escalated by showing up in the parking lot of my job, standing near my truck under the harsh Arizona sun claiming I had misinterpreted everything, her voice wavering between indignation and desperation, I felt none of the guilt she seemed to expect. She said it was just venting, that the group chat messages were exaggerated, that she had only consulted an attorney as a precaution, but every attempt to rewrite the story dissolved against the evidence Rachel had already provided, timestamps, direct admissions, discussions about provoking me into leaving first, and the quiet acknowledgement of her hidden $18,000 in credit card debt, along with the fact that she had been laid off months earlier without telling me. There was no room for revision once the truth was documented in black and white, and my attorney made sure every detail was preserved and submitted in a way that left no space for a fabricated narrative about abandonment or financial manipulation. The process was not quick, and it was not painless, but it was clear, and in the final settlement the outcome reflected the reality behind the performance. Vanessa kept the house in Mesa, along with a mortgage attached to it and the personal debt she had accumulated in secret, a decision she insisted on to preserve her image and stability, while I kept my truck, the savings I had managed to protect, and most importantly the freedom from any alimony obligations she had quietly hoped to secure. When the papers were signed and finalized, there was no dramatic closing scene, no last-minute confession or apology that changed anything, just signatures on documents, and a quiet acknowledgement that the version of marriage I had been trying to maintain had not existed for a long time. I walked out of that final meeting lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because divorce was easy, but because clarity is heavier when it is hidden than when it is faced, and, as I drove away in my truck under the relentless Arizona sun, I realized that the peace of mind I carried with me was worth more than the house I left behind. Months after the divorce was finalized and the dust had finally settled, my life looked quieter on the surface but stronger underneath, and when my supervisor called me in his office to tell me I was being promoted to operations lead with a stable salary of $82,000 a year, I felt a kind of steady pride that was different from the hollow validation I used to chase. Because this was not about image or performance, it was about consistency, reliability, and the years I had spent learning every inch of the facilities I helped maintain. The new role came with more responsibility, more oversight of scheduling and budgeting, but it also came with predictable hours, fewer overnight emergencies, and the sense that I was finally building something solid instead of constantly scrambling to hold things together. I moved into a quiet one-bedroom apartment in North Phoenix not long after, a place with clean white walls, a small balcony overlooking a row of desert landscaping, and just enough space for the furniture I actually needed. And the first night I slept there, I noticed the silence felt different from the silence I used to feel at Caleb's apartment or in my truck after long shifts. Because this time it was not temporary or uncertain. It was mine. I unpacked slowly, taking my time arranging the living room, setting up my kitchen exactly how I liked it. And for the first time in years, every bill, every expense, every decision in that space was straightforward and transparent. Somewhere along the way, I started talking more at work. Not about the divorce or the past, but about regular things, projects, weekend plans, small frustrations that felt manageable instead of overwhelming. And that was how I gradually grew closer to Brooke Jensen, a coworker from another department who had always struck me as grounded in a way that did not demand attention. She valued direct conversations, did not sugarcoat things for effect. And when we started seeing each other, it felt less like stepping into a performance and more like stepping into a conversation that did not require editing. One evening, we stood side by side in my kitchen cooking dinner, the smell of garlic and olive oil filling the apartment, music playing quietly from my phone on the counter, and I watched her move around the space without trying to stage it or critique it, just comfortable in the moment, and something inside me clicked in a way it never had before. I realized that the rooftop humiliation months earlier had not just ended a marriage. It had forced me to confront how long I had accepted disrespect disguised as humor, how often I had laughed along to avoid conflict, how easily I had allowed my role to shrink into background support for someone else's narrative. Standing there chopping vegetables while Brooke talked about her day, I understood that you cannot build a future with someone who is secretly scripting your exit, because a partnership cannot survive when one person is already planning the applause for the finale. The brunch scene that once felt like public embarrassment now looked different in retrospect. It was the moment clarity cut through exhaustion, the moment I stopped negotiating for basic respect, and walking away calmly under that Arizona sun had not been impulsive or dramatic. It had been deliberate. As I set the table that night and looked around my small but peaceful apartment, I felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with money or promotions and everything to do with self-respect. And I recognized that removing that ring and leaving without shouting had been the first truly strong decision I had made for myself in years. Not because it ended something, but because it finally aligned my actions with what I deserved.